What happens when you take somebody who's a really competent mixer in their genre and you take them outside of their genre and put them in a genre they probably shouldn't be working in? Now, I feel like it's either going to be a total disaster or an absolute home run that brings something fresh. And today we have a perfect example of when somebody comes from another genre, goes into one that they don't work in, and hits an absolute home run. And that, my friends, is Bullet For My Valentine's Fever, mixed by CLA. I absolutely love this mix, so we're going to break this down. Now, this is an interesting choice because, normally you would pick a band like this and you would expect somebody like Andy Sneap or Colin Richardson at the time to mix that. And that's a type of sound that you expect to hear when you listen to a metal band like this. But they brought in CLA on this record. And, at first, I didn't get this many years ago. I didn't really think much of this mix or care much for it. Now that I'm a little bit older, more advanced in my hearing, I actually think this is one of the coolest metal mixes I've ever heard. So let's go break this down here part by part. And it's going to be interesting to see how a rock mixer handles a metal mix. Here we go. Okay, that guitar tone is sick. Like right out of the gate, I love what he's done. Now, this is something that I feel like is getting missed in a lot of more modern productions, is when you listen to this guitar tone in the beginning, right? And it's a hell of a guitar tone. Pay attention to the near reflections from the room that you can hear on that guitar tone, meaning that you can hear the ambience of the room that it was recorded in. Listen. And that, my friends, adds what we call a little bit of depth. Now I feel like a lot of that gets taken out because so many people are using impulses, for example, impulse responses. There's no like dynamic near reflections in a room as an amp sound swirls off. So with all the modelers and impulses, I feel like that's something that's gotten lost that a lot of like 2000s guitar tones had that were just so killer. All right, let's carry on. Okay, so what's the loudest element in this mix? What do you hear? It's not the drums, it's not the guitars. They're actually pocketed back a little bit. It's the bass. That's what makes this sound so massive. Pay attention and focus on the bass guitar. You can really hear the near reflections here. Listen. So Chris is using that bass guitar to really, really push this song and, make it sound really massive. Again, this is not something I feel like I would hear in a traditional metal mix for a band like this. This is mixed very rock. So it's kind of a cool distinction because, you have a mix that has rock drums, right? Not metal drums, but rock drums. You have rock bass and you've got pretty metal sounding guitars, but the near reflections on them almost make them sound like, dare I say, a little bit rocky. So like everything going on right now, it just has a bit of a rock vibe to it. And it's really cool to hear a metal mix done this way because it's just not something you hear every day. So let's listen very carefully to the shells, the drum shells, meaning like the kick snare, the guitar and the bass, and just how everything locks. Starting at the bottom end, the kick is below the bass. Listen to the sub of the kick. So the kick is driving a lot of the sub energy. There's a lot of bass, but there's a lot of bass mid-range, if that makes sense. And the guitars also have a ton of mid-range. Like I'm talking like 800 to 1K. Listen to the like the honk region of the guitars. She makes me crave, so come and get my money. Tons and tons and tons of mids in those guitars. And, the guitars have a very smooth top end. They're not very bright. They're very mid-rangey. And the bass is very mid-rangey, pushing that. There's incredible separation that, only an SSL can do between the guitars and bass and just locks in that top end. It sounds fantastic. Now let's pay attention to the snare. So the kick is definitely a little bit more up front than the snare. The snare is a little bit back, and the snare is very rock sounding, meaning it's got a lot of ambience on it. It doesn't sound hyper compressed. Chris is not one that uses really high compression ratios. At least any mix he's ever done that I've ever seen is not the type of person that uses really high compression ratios in his drums. You can really hear that in terms of like the snare. It's got a very natural feel. Whereas if you're listening to like more of a traditional metal mix from like the earlier 2000s, you might hear a snare that's snapped a little bit harder, that's a little bit more compressed and pinned. This snare actually breathes. Now, one thing that's interesting about the kick is a lot of metal mixes would have a very dry, direct sounding sampled, one-shot kick. This sampled one-shot actually has ambience in it. And if you listen to it, you can hear the ambient glue. The kick drum actually sounds like it's in a space. You hear that? The kick drum is really connected in the mix because, like I said, there's an ambience on it. And if you really, really listen when there's like soloed kicks earlier in the song, you're going to hear it. All right, pay attention to the cymbals now. They're bright, but they're smooth. And this is really what I love about an SSL 4000 console that just like is really hard to get digitally, is that there's a natural kind of like distortion and breakup to it when you push it. Now I have an SSL Origin, which is essentially a 4000 circuit in front of me, and I mix on it every day for months now. And I will tell you that when you drive that type of board hard, it starts to break up on the top end and kind of roll everything off in a nice musical way. So when you hear the top end of this, which is very smooth, that's where that comes from. Because I know Chris definitely cranks a lot, is very extreme on his EQ moves, or I should say what people would consider extreme. It's very normal for modern rock mixers to crank 12 dB or 15 dB boosts, but a lot of that gets eaten up because the EQ bends and distorts in a pleasing way, and that's one of the sonic characteristics of a 4000 is the way it distorts when you crank EQ. It gets kind of crunchy in a way, and it smooths out. So listen how smooth the top end is, like the cymbals, the guitars, right? Sounds awesome. And by the way, if you enjoy this type of content, please give me a like and click subscribe and hit the notification bell. Anyways, carrying on. Let's listen to vocals. I like the vocal tone. It's very smooth. It's got, I'm going to back up. It's got a lot of upper mid-range to it. It sounds bright, like it's done on a condenser, but it's not like super, there's not a lot of like ultra fizzy top end, we'll call it like above 10K, like a pop vocal would have. Listen very carefully to how the frequencies are played. Now, what I like about how he's got the vocals is frequency-wise, because the guitars aren't super bright and there's a lot of like 800 to 1K in these guitars, he's kind of placed the vocal slightly above that in the range, meaning that, if you had a lot of bright, like 3 to 5K in your guitar, right, and it was kind of bright, or even 8, you've got to either move your vocals up or down around it. You know what I mean? They can either go for a really bright vocal, or you can go for a vocal that's more in like the, the lower part of the upper mid-range, if that makes sense. We're talking like 1K, 2K versus say boosting like 5 to 8. So it's interesting because there's a lot of space there for the vocal, and it fits very, very nicely in that, upper mid range, like the 4K to 2K area. Another thing that's really interesting about the vocals is how they're balanced, meaning the vocal really isn't that loud. The vocals are definitely mixed like a metal band. So listen to the volume of the vocal. Those backing vocals right there are almost as loud as the main center vocal is, which is, again, a pretty cool balance decision and not something that you see all the time in a mix. I like the toms are very nice and loud. They're not as ambient as, say, the snare, but, they're very punchy, not a lot of bottom end. The kick here, I was talking about the space on it. You can hear the ambience in the kick sample here. Hear it? He's actually got reverb on it. Another thing I like here is the bass isn't distorted, right? I mean, it's got a little bit of grit on it, but it doesn't have like a grind, and it's very, very clean sounding, which is also super cool to hear because a lot of metal mixes have heavily distorted bass. This one does not. Well, all right, this mix is awesome. I'm going to leave this here. I think that, like I said, normally when you take somebody who's very prominent in one genre and take them to a genre where they don't usually work, and that can usually spell trouble, but I think Chris has actually just like totally knocked this mix out of the park. Like I said, maybe like 2010, 11, 12, when this came out, somewhere in that area. I didn't really get this mix at that time because it was so different than other mixes. And I mean, it's not like I didn't think it sounded good, but it wasn't like my favorite mix. But, now looking back, I've really, really learned to appreciate the tones and just how everything fits together. I love how this mix sounds. It just sounds incredible. It cranks really well on a system. I think it's a fantastic metal mix, even though Chris is not a metal mixer. So it's great to see somebody coming from rock apply a total rock approach to a metal mix and hit it out of the park. The reason that I think this works is because there's not a lot of double kick drum. And if you go back and listen to the song on, like, say, Spotify after you're done watching this, you'll hear on the double kick parts, the kick is very rock, and it kind of gets you know, it's a little overbearing for like the fast double kick. So the fact that this doesn't have a ton of double kick allows you to have more of a rock mix and a rock type of drum sound as opposed to not. So thank you so much for watching this. If you got bands you want me to react to, please smash that below. If you want to learn how to mix music, check out nailthemix.com, the coolest place to learn how to mix music. And I'm always doing content on my Instagram and my TikTok. That's at Joel Wanasek. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time.